Welcome to Black Hat Windows 2K Security, held February 14th through the 15th, 2001 in Las Vegas, Nevada. The following videotape was recorded live at the conference and produced by the Sound of Knowledge Incorporated. This is videotape number 11, Technical Track, Safeguarding Your Business Assets Through the Win32API.
Okay, I'd like to welcome you to the 10:30 show. We're looking at safeguarding your business assets through understanding of the Win32 API, Application Programmed Interface. Our speakers today are Todd Feinman and David Goldman. They're both managers at PRICEWATERHOUSE. They're also starting a company called Secure, and David is going to talk about it. Todd is the CEO, David is the CTO. They've done a variety of things for PriceWaterhouse. And I was talking to Todd earlier, and he says he's taking an MBA program, and I'm just amazed. I'm trying to figure out where his free time is. I don't think he has any.
No, I don't.
So,
Zero.
Without any more, here they are.
Okay. That was the first couple of slides, which basically talked about who we were, but we just got an excellent introduction. So we're first going to kind of give you an objective for this class, or this session, which is to talk about some of the vulnerabilities inherent to the Win32 API and how we can look at those, understand those, and assess those, learn how to secure against those through talking about individual functions within the Win32 API and how those relate back to functions of the Windows operating system and functions of business. So we're going to look at it from a multi-tiered approach. We're going to use what we call a case study analysis. We're going to look at 3 real companies. We won't use their names, of course, but we will talk about their priorities, their use of these techniques, and what they can do to secure themselves, and what you can do then to take those back and secure yourselves. And we're going to talk about some best practices, about different functions, what kind of information you can gather, how you can gather that information, and what you can do to bring that all home.
I guess before we start, I want to get a feel for what type of audience you guys are, how technical you are, and what you're expecting from this. So just kind of by a show of hands, how many people here are security administrators? Okay. How many people here are software programmers? CIOs? Okay. So I want to understand from you guys what exactly you're looking to take away from this presentation. Are you guys looking for a deep technical knowledge of the Win32 API? Are you looking for an understanding of, well, you know, this is our business. How does it relate to what's going on at the operating system layer, and how do we secure the operating system to protect, again, the business? What is it? I mean, just shout out. I mean, what are your expectations for this presentation? Everybody's looking for the deep technical knowledge?
Yeah, why don't you give us the deep technical knowledge and let us decide how it affects our business.
What else? What else are you guys looking for? The meaning of life.
The conference as a whole is about security in Windows 2000. Your session is about Win32 APIs in some sense.
That's right.
It would be a good idea to talk about security Win32 APIs as it relates to Windows 2K.
Great. Anything else? Okay, good. First thing, to get a security assertion map, to understand what are we going to be looking at, because it's important to understand, you know, when we're talking about the Win32 API within Windows 2000, what it is you want to secure. There are 3 objectives for you to go about securing Windows. You want to secure against confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Very straightforward. These are kind of the auditor's assertions. These are your security assertions. Confidentiality. You have extremely sensitive data. You don't want anyone getting access to it. The most important thing is that no one procures that information. Integrity. You don't want the modification of that data. Also extremely important. Lastly, availability. We want that data to always be readily accessible. And I guess what we did was we kind of took those three and we mapped them to 5 forces within Windows. This is, you can argue, are there 5, are there 6, how is it that you break them down? We look at it at 5 levels: user, resource, network, system, and audit. User security, obviously, user security is dealing with users and groups and your account policy. Resources, your files, your directories, even the permissions you would put on services that are running. The system is, what are the services that are running? How are they executed? Are they running as local system? Are they running as a user? The registry, extremely important. Registry values, registry permissions, everything at that level. I mean, the registry is going to hold almost all the information at in Windows 2000 that's going to relate to security. The network, shares, give you access to the resources. You start to see how these all become related, but trusts, one domain's trusting another domain. So if you have one domain that's secured, another one that's not, and it's trusting that one, there's your in. Remote access is another piece, dial in. And lastly, auditing. Auditing is the last force. We look at that as your audit policy, the event log. I think what we do now is a demo. What we took was all of these assertions, we mapped them to each of the 5 forces, and we came up with, well, when we're securing our operating system, what is the pieces that we want to look at? So we said, well, at the confidentiality level, we want to look at user, system, network, resource, auditing. And at each of these levels, we map it down. So we're going to do a demo of basically the tool that we wrote to secure an operating system. This is simply something that just collects information. The purpose of this is to show at the Win32 API level, what are the calls that are being made to actually procure information from a Windows 2000 box? Hackers use these same Win32 API calls to get access to your information. Any hacker can grab C compiler, write certain Win32 API calls to your box, run it to your box, and grab information. They don't have to actually be authenticated as anyone. There are things called the null credentials logon. Well, what we did was we took it at 2 levels. One is if you were a full administrator and you wanted to secure your business assets. Well, if you're a full administrator, these are the different things that you want to actually look at. You grab the information, talk about how to secure it later.
Okay, so as was said in our introduction, the name of the tool is called VelociCure, and I'm going to run it locally on my box here. Just VelociCure with a -F is full mode, and as I hit enter, you can see all of the collection, and we will go back and run through this once it's finished. What it's done in that couple seconds while I was speaking is take a security snapshot of this box, gather all of the information that we are concerned about as an administrator, as Todd said, and we're going to discuss the calls that this program exploits. So there are some different colors, and I'm going to have to go back into the GUI here just to scroll up for you. And it's broken down by the 5 forces of user, network, resource, system, and auditing. So in the beginning here, in the white part, is just the initialization. It's reading directories, registry keys, registry values from our internal best practices. Those are the specific components that we're going to look at when we assess those sections. So the first area we're looking at here is system security. We're determining what type of server this is. Is it a domain controller? Is it a terminal server? Is it a cluster server? Because based on that single piece of information, now we know that there are different parts of this server that we can attack. If it's a domain controller, we know it has a copy of the account database. And as we know on Windows 2000, every domain controller has a writable copy of the Active Directory. So now potentially there's a place for us to exploit at any domain controller. We are looking at network interfaces. We're looking at network protocols. Do we have TCP/IP? Do we have NWLink and IPX, things like that? What's running on the box? Processes, registry values. What is the debugger set to? That's something we might want to change to exploit. Known DLLs, WinReg, run key, all the common things that you see security bulletins on at Microsoft all the time. Those are the types of information that we want to gather so then we can later change values or replace programs that those values point to, all those types of things. registry permissions, again. Services, this goes back to server type. If we're running a SQL server, an Exchange server, a web server, an FTP server, all of those things give us information to lead us to the next point of security. And then at the end of this, we talk about device and system drivers, which relate back to services, and then jobs. What is this system running?
That was actually all pieces of one of the forces. And the reason the program is broken down this way is because system is actually going to give you information for how to check the other pieces, as David was explaining. So while we look at user, resource, system, network, auditing, and that level, it's important to always look at system first when you're actually doing a scan. Again, you want to know what the box is doing before you actually tell it what it should be doing. Next piece is auditing. Again, it's just looking at the event log. It's looking at your audit policy. It's looking at those different pieces of information. Network security assessment. Unfortunately, David's box isn't connected to a network. So when we do this type of network security scan, there's nothing to actually pull off of the box. So it says, you're not a domain controller. We're not looking at trust relationships. And remote access isn't running, so there's no dial-in. Resource security. Now we've gathered enough information about the box with Win32 API calls to understand what it's doing. Is it a domain controller? Is it a cluster server? When you go through those pieces, I mean, it's not important to actually, the understanding is that all the blue is resource security. So when we go into the registry, we pull where the system directory is, because sometimes it's not going to be at c:\WinNT. We gather the information, now we run our resource security piece and we gain all information about where sensitive files are stored. One of the pieces that we're going to talk about later in one of the case studies is within the registry there's a section called the allowed paths. Well, the allowed paths allow people to gain access to sections of the registry regardless of the permissions on the WinReg key. The WinReg key we'll also talk about, but that's basically the key that secures the entire registry. If you think of the entire registry as being an object within Windows 2000, well, there's actually a share that allows you to connect to the registry, just like a share allows you to connect to a directory. That share is protected by a key within the registry called the WinReg key. It's actually a registry share. And it's not actually called that in any of the books, but it's also difficult because it's kind of a cyclical error in that one key within the registry secures the entire registry at a network layer. So when we pull this information, hackers could probe the Windows 2000 allowed paths registry key, gather all the registry keys that are allowed to be read by a null credential or anyone else, and then start probing those to gain more information. One of these keys, by default, is the current version key. Within the registry, the current version key gives you a lot of information about the box. Specifically, it allows you to go into another key called AE debug, which is where the Windows 2000 debugger is spawned when an application crashes. There was a big bulletin posted about this, I think, last year with NT40. Still exists in 2000 as something that could be done if it's not secured appropriately. Well, when we look at things like the resource security, we want to make sure things like the debugger, which would be Dr. Watson 32.exe, can't be replaced. We want to make sure that the registry keys have permissions on them so that hackers can't come in and change that. And then the last piece, the fifth force is going to be the user security. And this is kind of the last piece. We do this on the back end because the users, really there's no effect on anything else that's going on. Question?
Question regarding WinReg and
Yes.
the allowed paths. If WinReg, how do you query the registry to determine what you're allowed?
Okay. I want to repeat the question slightly differently. Let me know if this is what you're asking. The question was, how do you query the Windows 2000 registry to understand what what information is accessible through the network?
As a blind audit from someone outside, ACLs are set appropriately on the WinReg. You have the allowed, the other key that allows certain areas. How do I determine which areas are allowed?
Okay. The question is, how do I determine what areas are allowed to bypass the WinReg key?
Yes.
Okay. So the WinReg key secures the entire registry with exception of all the keys listed in the allowed paths key. The allowed paths key is at HKey local machine, system, current control set, secure pipe server, WinReg, allowed paths. We'll write it down for you later so you can write it down if you didn't want to follow that whole long spiel. That allowed paths is a multi-string registry value, which means you can have a lot of values separated by carriage returns. And within that key, though that multi-string is a listing of all the other registry keys that are allowed to bypass WinReg permissions.
Is allowed paths in there? I mean, how do I get to allowed paths?
Inherently, Windows 2000 allows you to get to allowed paths because anytime, this is not really a flaw at all within Windows 2000. This is by design. Because if you're on one computer in the network and you want to perhaps print to another computer, but you don't, it's an open access printer, you want to be able to use that print server without having to authenticate with a username. Perhaps you're on the internet and there's like a public printer out there, or your intranet. Anyone in the firm is allowed to print, or even visitors are allowed to print. This computer probes the server, and the allowed paths allow it to automatically do that. So right off the bat, I forgot the actual key, but print, there's actually a printing key, and we'll show that to you later throughout the cases, that says, oh, anyone can access this key, and that's what allows them to figure out the printer name and allow them to print. Question?
You're saying by default, a null user can connect to the registry and query the allowed paths key? Is that what you just said?
No, what he's saying is there are a certain amount, and it differs from Windows NT to Windows 2000, of registry paths that are listed in the allowed paths by default in order for certain functions like printing to work. So there's probably 8 or 10 that are there by default, and that's one of the places that you can start.
You can't query.
Can I query that set, or can I even query any of the keys?
The question was from the perspective of a security administrator doing an audit.
I thought it was a null session.
Null session.
From a null session,
Someone operating in the blind.
From a null session, you have
How do I
to,
determine which paths are allowed?
you would not be able to query the allowed paths key and get actual answers from it. You would need to use the default values.
or a brute force.
Correct. And there are ways to secure against that, which we're going to talk about in one of the cases. Basically, there's a key that says, actually, let's wait for the case because I don't want to go down the path too far.
Actually, null session can't connect to the registry after Service Pack 2 or 3. On NT4 and 2000, a null session can never connect to the registry unless you enable it by default. As soon as you say, I want to talk to WinReg, bam, you're locked out.
If we have time later, we'll do a demo that shows.
See it, because I just went through that last week.
It'll be exciting. Okay. Any other questions about that before we kind of go off the 5 forces and into some of the other areas?
Is that tool available, or do you guys keep that internal?
We keep it internal. Actually, PriceWaterhouseCoopers keeps that internal. But we'll talk about how it works at any level that you want. Okay, good. So that's basically, this is kind of how we do a security assessment. Again, we want to probe as much information that's security relevant as possible to get it off. Now, this isn't in your slides, this is something we put together. I want to breeze through this because what this does is maps different pieces of the 5 forces security assertion flows to objects within your business. This is more for people who are concerned about, well, how do I justify a budget to my CIO to get more funding for security? Because this maps it to revenue and expenses. So I'm going to go through this quickly. I assume based on the introduction that you guys gave to me, no one wants to go through this at any deep layer. Is that correct? Good. The kind of letters on the left represent user, resource, system, network, audit. The one on the right is confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So we map them through. For example, user confidentiality. What is something that might be in that area of confidentiality of users? Well, their social security number could be printed in the Active Directory. Another one might be, resource integrity. Some of my resources are my clients' investment portfolios. The integrity of that is very important. If they buy 30 shares of Microsoft in the morning and Microsoft plummets, we want to make sure at the end of the day they didn't change that to a sell short. As I said, I'll go quickly. System integrity. Is my website being spoofed? I want to make sure someone didn't modify my actual website. Network availability. I mean, this is how you guys make money. If your network isn't up and running, people can't connect to your site. You know, example is like E-Trade, who gets, you know, over 1 million transactions per day at $8 per trade. If these guys go down for an hour, even if it is, let's say it is 8 million trades per day, in 1 hour, so they do business on a standard 8-hour while the market's open, in 1 hour they're going to lose 1 million trades at $8. It's $8 million simply because of availability of the network. Linking them to profit and loss, social security numbers, it's an expense because of employee trust. Things like, you know, passwords being compromised, the expense of having to change the passwords, or the example I just used of network availability. If you can't simply have your network up and available, you know, revenue, it's volume. And tracing these back to the Win32 API layer, things like user confidentiality, links to user rights, your client's assets, to the permissions, resource, again, we're looking at permissions. Any questions on this stuff since I'm skipping a lot of it to get to the meat? So what are hackers going to do?
Okay, so this kind of goes back to the question we had just at the beginning. Blind audit from the outside or somewhere on the internal network without authentication. What kind of information can I gather by default? So through a null session, you know, a net use or using the you know, direct Win32 API calls, what kind of information can we gather? And by default, it's an extraordinary amount of information. User listing, group listing, share listing. We can start from that information to find out, you know, if the administrator account has been renamed, what is it renamed to, start going after that. Now I know what the guest account is, does that have a blank password, and build off that. In NT4, their registry key, restrict anonymous, you could set it to 1. In 2000, you could set it to 1 or 2, still 0 by default. And that is a best practice for kind of your first stopgap. What are we going to do to prevent this information gathering?
What does 2 do beyond 1? Like setting it to 2 instead of 1, what added security do you get?
It's specific 2000. There's some more information within Windows 2000 because of the whole pre-Windows 2000 compatible group, which is part of the everyone by default. So there's information that, you know, you can query out of Active Directory.
So 2 turns off the everyone group?
It doesn't turn off the everyone group. It just restricts more the information.
Actually, can get you an exact answer on that because it's one of the, what they did in Windows 2000, I'm sure most of you are aware, they put a lot of those important registry keys into a little GUI for us using Microsoft Management Console. So I'll just pop it up and get you the exact option, the exact answer to that. But I mean, what I believe it does is 1 says you can still connect with null and probe users and groups and all that. You just can't get access to certain pieces, but I mean, and 2 would say you can't get access to anything. So 0 means none, you rely on default permissions with the restrict access, so null can get and you rely on default permissions. If you're null and it says everyone full control, you have full control. 1 says you can't allow the enumeration of SAM accounts and shares. So, and then the last one, which was a 2, would say no access without explicit anonymous permissions. So you'd have to explicitly say anonymous had specific access, null credentials, specific access, which would actually be included if it didn't have a discretionary access control list at all. For example, a FAT drive.
Okay. And once we gather certain information with null, or once we use that to discover a username or password, we kind of step up a level, and now we're at user level access. That gives us a whole new range of Win32 API calls. Yes?
How does one go from the anonymous access to gaining the username and password?
Well, there are a couple different techniques. One might be...
We should do it during the case.
Okay. We'll talk about it during the case.
Real short answer, there are Win32 API calls that say, if you are null, you're allowed to do all of this, assuming restrict anonymous isn't set to disallow it.
But that presumes you ran a Win32 API call.
Correct.
In all cases of Windows 2000, are you implying that through anonymous connection, you can gain a username and password?
Yes.
Absolutely. And we'll go through the case example in more detail, but The answer to your question is absolutely yes.
Okay.
There's
Just to clarify,
I think,
you
are
can't
you getting
necessarily.
are you getting at the pre-Windows 2000 group? There's a group in Windows 2000. Okay, we'll talk about that later too.
Let me just clarify real quick. You can't necessarily read a password as null, but you could read a username and then lead to brute force attack, or if you have a large user listing, there may be password or null, things like that, and you can test those. That is a separate activity.
Two steps.
2 steps. And then once you progress to the point where you have a valid username and password, which might be blank or null, now we're at the user level. So we have a whole new range of calls. Then from user level, we use that information. Again, we'll talk about during the case. And then you might be able to get to administrative level. And from that, now you've got full control, and you can get everything that we just talked about. And clearly, your confidentiality, integrity, availability, all of those are at that point could be breached.
Do me a favor. Sorry. I interrupt him a lot, guys. It's bad.
I was just saying from that perspective.
Later, when we talk about this, if we forget to bring it up, ask that question again, because there's something called the pre-Windows 2000 group. I'll get the exact name for you, but that's actually a very important factor when you talk about this in Windows 2000. So it's a really good point. Apologies. Yes. Well, so I guess from our perspective, this notion of null is actually one of the biggest ways that we see hackers getting in, because I mean, a lot of the attack and penetrations that we've done revolve around you having no information about a box. You probe it. You do these Win32 API calls to get as much information as you can as null. If they've turned off Restrict Anonymous, or they've turned off the server service, which means you can't even get a NetBIOS connection to the box, they've done a really, that's a huge step in protecting the box. Typically, these things aren't done because Restrict Anonymous in the past, a lot of clients have said to us, well, it creates incompatibilities, we can't do it, we can't roll it out to 4,000 servers in our organization, it's going to take us a couple years to do that kind of thing. There are many different excuses, and they're very legitimate. But what we see typically is null is allowed. So the very first thing we do is we grab every single piece of information null allows. We grab all the user groups, all the user listings, group identities. So now we can figure out what we get from that information is who's in the administrators group, what are their usernames, and then all the other information about them, like what's their full name and all that. Because what we use is that information to actually try to figure out their password. We do a brute force attack on that. Hopefully that gets us more information, maybe at a user level. So we remove our connection as null, we make it user. Once we get user, there are other types of calls you can make, like probing the service control manager, which tells you now what services are running. Hopefully there's one maybe you can exploit. You try to grab the share information. You could grab all the shares that exist on a box if null is allowed, if Restrict Anonymous isn't secured. Once you get all those shares, you figure out, does everyone have full control on all of them, which is the default ACL. And taking things like, well, maybe there's a share that connects, maybe there's a share where there's a service executable running. Well, now maybe we could replace that service executable with one of our Trojan horses. And now what you've done is you've been able to put a file on the computer that allows you to run any executable that you want to upload as local system. And I mean, there's lots of different ways to approach this. That's just one of many, many ones. Question.
Blocking the NetBIOS port sufficient, or are there ways that people have found to get around that and still get some calls?
The question was, is blocking the NetBIOS ports efficient? Sufficient. Oh, sufficient or?
You're right. So, which means that you can't do these, Win32 API calls into the.
See, that's what a lot of people are doing. So, let's take perimeter security. Like a firewall would block 135, which is RPC, 137, 8, and 9, which are the NetBIOS ports. One of them is for fragments, datagrams. The last one's for NetBIOS names. So now someone can't get into a share. You cannot connect to a share. You can't run any Win32 API calls if those are blocked. Is that
445?
445?
Windows 2000 SMB.
Okay, great, thank you. So what you've done is you've mitigated that, but I don't want to say that that's not sufficient, because today, if you have a web server in your environment, people will go to that web server on port 80, perhaps try to attack it using, there was a lot of attacks talked about yesterday about attacking a web server on port 80. What was there, a Unicode buffer overflow that I think one of the companies talked about. But what happens then is you use that server as like a port redirector. So if you can attack that web server on port 80, now you install a port redirector, go to that on port 80, and now you have port 135, 136, 137, 8, and 9, and 445 to the other Windows boxes. Yes?
Just a statement, it really doesn't matter. Most of the losses that are occurring, according to the FBI, at the corporate level are from within the firewall anyway.
It's a great point. I think we did a survey that said 85% of attacks come from inside the firewall.
So put all the attention you want on your firewall, but do not forget corporate policy and your inside stuff.
Right. Clearly, the soft, mushy underbelly of the firm is everything within the perimeter security, and that's why all of this stuff is still very, very important and increasingly important.
So SNMP, you said? SMB. It's 445. Okay. Great. So that was kind of our intro to how the attacker. So now we're looking at this as, let's say 85% of the attacks or some large number come from the inside. Well, these people do have NetBIOS activity. They are going to be using Win32 API calls. Case number 1. Let's see how we're doing on time. Case number 1. This is a pharmaceuticals company, enterprise-wide employee directory. They want everyone to be able to access this directory to gain pretty much public information. So this isn't, their primary concern is not confidentiality. Their primary concern is the integrity and availability of it. Actually, the primary concern is availability because people need to be able to get access to information. Let's say there's a doctor working on a formula. He needs to figure out, well, who has expertise in this area? So he's always probing, a domain controller to find out, who's got access to this. So why is this so important to them? Again, directors and managers require access to find out, well, what's this person's phone number? We got a fire alarm going on. Like, who do we call? Complex, hierarchical, corporate authority. So these guys, very important. They want all 60,000 employees to be able to get access to this directory at any time, immediately. They have 24 domains. So there's a lot of ways you can look at this. One way that they were concerned about looking at it from their perspective for an assessment was to look at, 1, are all the domain controllers available? We want to make sure that none of them have been, removed. None of them are brought down. None of them have been denial of service. Another thing they want to look at is, can users search the directory? Do they actually have authority to do that? And can they only search certain areas of it? Again, it's not really a confidentiality issue. It's availability. So it's not like the social security numbers of people are in this database. They want to make sure no one's trying to compromise the availability of the servers. Is someone trying to get access to the registry so they could place a Trojan horse in there? Is someone trying to do some type of denial of service attack? And the last piece, again, they threw this out, was we want to make sure our printers are accessible by everybody. So another thing they wanted to look at were printer accessibility. All these kind of in the line of availability. We could argue all day confidentiality is equally as important and integrity. We're just going to focus on this one piece for the case study.
Okay, so this is now kind of the nuts and bolts where we get into. So the first thing we want to do is we want to get a list of users and their properties. We want to find out, what accounts are disabled, what are locked out, or monitor for those things because, again, availability is our highest concern. So we're looking at NetUser enum and NetUser GetInfo, which are both accessible via null connections. And as we said earlier, some of this is from the perspective of hacking. A lot of it is from the perspective of the administrator looking at the network to determine what needs to be secured. So just so you know my notation, the function calls and then whether or not they're available through null in parentheses. Some have NT4 only, some are Windows 2000 only. Yes?
In your description of the domain controllers, does this say mixed domain environment, NT4 to 2000?
I didn't bother writing it down. It was mixed domain. So the reason I guess that was important was because certain attacks could be run at the NT4 level to gain access to the 2000 controllers.
So possibility exists that they've done this in native mode scenario like this?
Oh yeah, the scenario actually would have been quite different because we.
Particular case presumes mixed mode NT4.
Yes, to repeat, this case does presume mixed mode, NT4, and Windows 2000. Thanks for the clarification.
So again, these two function calls are available via null. And best practices in this instance are, because availability is the highest concern, watch for locked out and disabled accounts, find out what's going on with those. Maybe there's intrusions, maybe there's not intrusions. But again, that's our main concern. We don't want to force log-offs, and we don't want people to have to log on in order to change their password, because if it's coming through an intranet or a browser-based, you'll get that kind of hanging thing. Yes?
Will you make the updated slides available?
Yes, we actually
have
have the whole
They're up here.
presentation, and we have a box of them, so at
We're
the
going to hand
end,
them out for you guys.
you can come up and get them. Okay, thanks. So that's kind of the first step, as we said. We are trying to look at this environment and figure out, so as Todd,
Oh, no, I was going to start to address the gentleman's point from earlier, but continue on your line.
you can go ahead.
I just wanted to, I mean, we're talking about the user security piece now, so it's very important to raise your issue from earlier, which was, what happens in Windows 2000 with this, this probing using a null credential to gain access to all users or groups? Well, in NT4.0, the way it worked was, if someone made a net user GetInfo call, which has to be preceded by a net user enum, which also required null, you could just gain all the information about a user that's stored on the computer except for the password. You could find out what their logon hours are, you could find out what workstations they're allowed to log in from, you could find out when the last time they logged in, when the last time they changed their password, anything, full name, description, what groups they're a member of, etc. The difference in Windows 2000 by default is nothing. However, very simple step. If you don't want to go through the restrict anonymous piece, which basically disallows all the enumeration of accounts, etc., there's something called the pre-Windows 2000 compatible access group. Just so you guys know, this is Microsoft's Developers Network Platform SDK. Contains all the information about all the Win32 API calls that you guys could ever want to know. And what happens with this pre-Windows 2000 compatible access group is it simply inherently is used by Windows 2000 to say, well, how does this relate to Windows NT4? We're going to make it compatible, backwards compatible with NT4 for specifically this type of environment of mixed mode. So what happens is, if you simply remove everyone, which by default is a member of this group, if you remove it, they can no longer use this type of call. And it probably says on there.
Right, what happens at that point is the ACLs on the Active Directory objects themselves take precedence.
Right.
So is your point here that the way they set up Windows 2000 by default with this default group still allows this net user landman call to gain information?
Absolutely. So to repeat it for the rest of you guys, what we're saying is, by default within Windows 2000, it's the exact same functionality as NT4, but they made it very easy for you to remove it, to fix this, simply by saying, well, I'm not going to make this NT4.0 compatible. I'm going to remove the everyone group from this group called pre-Windows 2000 compatible access. That's the name of the group. Everyone is a member of it. The null credentials logon is a member of everyone.
The next follow-on question would be, presumably this organization's got this mixed environment for a reason. They care about backward compatibility. They come in with the Windows 2000 main controllers and life is good, but they're exposed this way. If they remove and make the change you suggested, what else do they lose?
The question was, so what are the repercussions of removing this group? And it's funny. Clients sometimes have had no problem. They remove it. This is not required. You don't necessarily need this to authenticate to the domain controller. This was just something that was simply put in there by default because an application like Samba might need it. Things like that. We've had clients remove it for the most part and have had no problems. But I can't say I can't make the broad statement that says, remove it, you're going to be secured, no problems. There might be some backwards compatibility problem.
Well, one of the things we've done is gone through and anywhere there is an ACL that is listed for everyone, just change it to authenticated users.
It's a great step. What they did in their organization was went to the ACL of each object and they changed the default permissions, removed everyone and put authenticated users. It's great. Is there anyone else here who has something else that they've done that's been successful? Yes?
We changed the schema so that authenticated users are removed from newly built OUs. We
Okay.
use dedicated ACLs for OUs.
Also, I mean, that's actually an additional step, because now what they did was they removed authenticated users from the default OU, from the schema. So you don't use, so authenticated users is exactly the same as the everyone group, with the exception of the null credentials logon is not included in it. So you guys actually took an extra step and said, we're not even using that because that's essentially everyone except for null. We're going to use explicit permissions, which is usually very time consuming. That is a fantastic step in getting to a secure model. Because what the theory behind that, which we're going to talk about later, is you grant people the least privileges required. And the least privileges required would say, well, not everyone who's an authenticated user needs this. Only Bill, only Dave, etc.
Okay, so we've gone through user listings. We've touched on groups already. But again, using the net group enum, group get info, now we can see, so say we have 10,000, 20,000 users. We've got a lot of information. We're trying to figure out, either how to secure or how to hack this environment. Who do we really care about? And that's where the group information comes in. Who's in administrators? Who's in high privileged accounts like server operators, account operators, things along those lines. And the reason we care about this is because in a lot of organizations, when we do an attack and penetration, we almost have information overload because the environments are these steps that, of this whole room, 2 people mentioned specific actions that they've taken, and I'm sure other of you have, but don't want to speak up, or using the same technique. But a lot of companies do nothing. And they either don't understand, don't have the resources, don't have the time, money, etc. So you can get an astounding amount of information, huge user listing. So we'll take this to say, now we've got these 35 administrators or these 20 server operators, and we can target individuals. And this is kind of from our first slide in our demo. Basically, the approach here is gather information, assess that information, and then move on to the next step. Yes?
Given the complexity now occurs to Security Configuration Manager templates, what's your experience been with them, matching up against this? Say you pick one of those security levels and apply those templates. How good are you finding them?
Okay.
There are billions of settings that have.
Right. The default templates included with Service Configuration Manager for NT4 or Windows 2000. That's
Right, so that was the question. Security Configuration Manager was released with Service Pack 4 on the CD. People have been using that on NT4. It's part of 2000. When people apply those templates, how good are they? What kind of information is this restricting? And that's a very good question. To a certain extent, it helps, clearly. There are portions of that let you restrict group membership, let you set ACLs on registry keys, let you set ACLs on directories. There are also a lot of things that it does not do. It does not let you set ACLs on shares. It does not let you create and delete shares. It does not let you start and stop service. Well, it does let you stop and start services, sorry. It does not let you add or remove services and things like that. So it gets you a certain amount of the way. And when we use Security Configuration Manager and its templates for our clients to secure environments, we build that into a scripting process that includes several other tools to kind of finish the job. So it's a great step, and it gets people part of the way, as are some of these other things that we've mentioned. But there's still a lot more to go.
I guess the one thing I would add is typically anything that's out there as a default, anything that's there that says like this is the general security mode that you can use to apply to your environment, typically won't be as secure as if you did it yourself because they don't want to break anything. And therefore they're going to use kind of the maximum amount of security that doesn't break anything regardless of the type of environment. So you will always be able to do one step better by customizing it for your environment. But the other thing I would like to do is throw it back at you guys and say, well, what's your experience by using the default templates? Does anyone have any information to provide on what their experience in using the default? I mean, we've never, we don't secure our clients using the defaults. The one thing I would, so adding to that also, and just kind of building off what I was saying earlier, I do like the fact that they're kind of been split off now into workstation and server, and I think it's workstation, application server, and domain controller. They don't really call it application server, but so that's one step that you guys do want to be taking. You want to say to yourself, is it a domain controller? Well, if it's not, well, what is it doing? If it's an application server or a file server, security does need to be applied in different ways. It's not drastic. I'm not saying, you know, well, every single registry key is going to be a different permission, but there will be differences. We're all done with groups. So groups is another one of those calls that can be, again, probed with a null credential. You can grab all the information listings. The other things that we've kind of stumbled along, which we didn't really have in our kind of attack and penetration best practice, was sometimes we'll do this group call, and we'll be able to find out where some of those other trusting domains are, or trusted domains. Because when you do a group get info call on a domain controller, sometimes you're going to see members of groups from other domains, and now you're like, oh, well, maybe that's another domain I should be going after. So again, more information. So that's kind of getting them at availability of users. You know, we've done an assessment now of you know, the pharmaceutical environment for this company, 60,000 users. We now know they're all there. You know, counts haven't been locked out. You know, we know brute force attacks aren't going on. So now we're going to look at resource security for this pharmaceuticals company.
Okay, and again, the resource that was important in this example was printers, ACLs on printers. So the first thing we did was in EnumPrinters get a list of what printers are installed, what exists on that remote machine, and then used GetNamedSecurityInfo, which is kind of a multi-purpose function, because what you do is you say what type of object you're looking for security on. In this case, we call that with printers, but we can call that with DACLs, with discretionary access control lists, for files, for
registry permissions, service permissions.
Right, all kinds of objects, including mail slots, UNC names, file names. It's very extensible. And we can also call that for system access control lists if we want SACLs, audit settings, ownership, information like that. So this is a pretty broad function that you'll only see here in our example, but it's used in many places to get many different pieces of information.
This requires normal user level access, right?
Excellent. Thank you. The question was, does this require normal user level access? The answer is yes. It does not run with null. You cannot do an EnumPrinters with null. Again, so I guess the overlooking kind of theory behind this was, how do we assess our environment? Not everything in here is going to be, how do we attack our environment? Because again, at the end of the day, we want to safeguard our business assets, not figure out whose business habits we could, you know, steal or compromise.
Okay, so network information. Again, here's a couple of null calls, and just for reference, in Windows NT 4.0, I think there was around 42 Win32 API calls that you could call over null. And in Windows 2000, some of those are changed, and there are some new ones kind of added in based on the pre-Windows 2000 compatible group. So, you know, around 40, 45 different functions. We're obviously not going to go through all of those today. Network station get info, network station transport enum gives us information about the transports that are running, you know, if it's NetBEUI, NetBIOS, NWLink, things along those information. I thought
There's
you were bringing it
41.
up. Okay.
There they are. But
Okay.
we'll talk about each of those later. Not every single one of them, but.
Right. So clearly the best practice here is install only the necessary transports, because if we discover information that there are, you know, 5, 6 different transports running, then all of a sudden we can start exploiting any inherent weaknesses to those, or, you know, you've now opened up more access points to your server, more access methods to your server, and clearly that's a path of attack, and therefore a place to secure.
The other piece, I guess I would add, is that you can figure out, you know, if it's NT or 2000, and you could also figure out what its minor number is, which is what the service pack level is, which is what you'd get as null. There's actually other information, though, that these calls give you if you are authenticated as administrator. So you can't determine domain membership if you're null. You cannot determine domain membership if you're null. Is that true? Now I'm getting myself confused. Domain membership, you can? No. Yeah, I mean, there's other ways around it. There's other ways around it. But the LSA, we're actually going to use LSA query information policy throughout the presentation because, again, that's like the GetNamedSecurityInfo. It's used in many places. That call, along with GetNamedSecurityInfo, needs more authentication than null. I believe it needs administrator or account operator.
Right. One of these things, and I'll get to you in just a second. One of the things about most of these Win32 API calls is that they will return a variety of data structures to you. There are, when you call user information, there's probably 35 different data structures that it will return to you based on the type of information that you request from it. So if you are null, you may only be able to return, say, 3 or 4 pieces of information, like, this is just a made-up example, but like name, phone number, and address. Then if you call it with different parameters, you have maybe a slightly higher level of access, it'll return you a data structure with much more information. So you may use one function at many levels of an attack or an assessment. First to say, I'm at this level, give me whatever information I can get, and then later, now I want it with a user info 10 structure and everything that comes with that. So there's that kind of difference. And, okay, your question now?
I just want to know, is there a simple list in this documentation, or did you have to query on a particular simple piece of list?
We did to get, the question is, and I'm going to add a little piece onto that, did we have to run a query to get a listing of all the null required with 32 API calls? We did. We did a query of, it's just called no special group memberships required, which is equivalent to null credentials logons.
Right. In the documentation for each of the calls, as you can see up here, there's a security requirements section. And under Windows NT 4.0, you can search for that no special group membership phrase. On Windows 2000, you can search for the pre-Windows, by default, the pre-Windows 2000 compatible access group. And those are basically the two things that will come up with this list of functions.
So you'll see that there's actually a lot of information. And again, this is all like enticement information for hackers. It's not like it's going to give you a password. It's going to give you a lot of stuff that leads towards that. Okay, network security. There's 2 parts to this. The first is to figure out what are the trusting domains. Well, you can't hack a trusting domain and necessarily get a direct entry into the trusted domain, but you can with the vice versa. So to get the information about trusting domains is a little bit easier. You can use a null credentials logon with net user get info and figure out, if you do a filter on filter interdomain trust account, it tells you all the machine accounts that are members of the domains that are a member of your domain. So they are trusting. So hackers will typically maybe try to get access to this because they know that you're accessing information on those servers, but the ones you really want to go after are the trusted. Because if they're trusted and you break into them, you can get access to this one, because typically, by default, actually all the time, when you join the membership of another domain, your domain admins gets added to their domain admin. So right off the bat, if you get access to one domain, you get access to another. That could be controlled a little bit by, of course, removing domain admins from one domain. So to do a trusted domain query, we go back to the LSA enumerate. We go back to, this is actually a new one, LSA enumerated trusted domains. LSA enumerate trusted domains. And this gives you the information of who do I trust. And of course, the best practice is to only trust domains that have at least as good a security as you do.
Will that run at user level or at admin level?
I think that requires administrators and account operators, but I can tell you that right now. This requires, doesn't tell us in the SDK, which means typically it requires administrators or account operators. this is one of those areas where hackers typically go through the SDK and figure out, well, it doesn't actually say what's going on. It's actually a lot of calls. There's one we're going to mention later, which has kind of not been overly publicized, but things like this is when the hackers go out and write the call and just keep adding one level of authority to their listing. So they try it at the guest level, they try it at the null level, they try it at the user level, they try it administrator, and sometimes the SDK has no information on it, and then hackers figure out, well, here's one area we can exploit. So I actually don't have a positive answer for you, but yes. The last piece is auditing security, the audit piece for pharmaceuticals company. Again, they are concerned about availability. So they want to see our user accounts maybe being brute force attacked to be locked out or something along those lines. So in terms of auditing, they're concerned about, are there bad logon attempts? Are there accounts being locked out? Are there object access failures? And that's what the event logs down there are saying, which are 529, 530. 529 is, I don't want to go through all these, but 529 is, was the account, did it have a bad password attempted? 539, was it locked out? 612 is, was there an object access failure? And the other piece is the event log. We need our event log to be large enough to be able to retain this type of information. So typically 60,000 users. This information is going to be on each domain controller, though. So each domain controller has to have this level of information. So it's important that the event logs on each domain controller, so there were 24 at this pharmaceuticals company, had 15 megabytes, set to 14 days. One of the best practices, though, we said, though, 14 days might not be enough. You want to figure out how quickly is that 15 megabytes being filled. So you set it to 15 megabytes and then kind of forever, find out what happens. And then if it's like a 23-day period, you want to set it to 23 days, make sure your backups do a backup of that event log so you always have that information. Any questions on case number 1? And I guess I'll just add, you need to be a member of you have to have the user right manage, manage security and event log to perform the read event log call. So by default, the only people who have that are administrators. What we typically see for best practices is you add a group to your domain called auditors. Because really, I mean, yes, your administrators are the most trusted people in your organization, but sometimes it's nice to have that segregation of duties. A lot of clients come back to us and say, yeah, that's a fantastic idea. If you have $200,000 to implement that type of thing for us, that'd be great, thanks. So. Case 2 is Yellow Pages Publishing Company, largest one in the world. Maybe. Data warehouse is extremely important to them because they have a lot of customers coming in, updating graphic files. They're constantly coming in. Their content management is extremely important to these guys. So they have 100,000 customers, account information, and data. Again, it's things like the text, it's the graphic images. So they have over 100 file servers for all these people, very large file servers. And what they are extremely concerned about is confidentiality. Can Mr. Pizza get access to Pizzeria Uno's advertising information before it's released so that we can kind of one-up them, make our ad one bigger, one more colorful, whatever it is. Integrity and availability, not the biggest concern because everything gets QC'd at the end. So again, customers' advertisements are a competitive advantage in this environment. And they also need access to their data 24/7, which is kind of like their secondary concern of availability. So they're going to do a primary assessment and say, well, we want to see if our assets are secured. So what are we going to do? We're going to look at the file server directory access controls and see if they're appropriate. Is a share set so that everyone has full control? Can agents, so the agents are the people who come in and update graphic files, can they update only their authorized company's data, or can they actually go outside their boundaries? Is there going to be unauthorized reading of other companies' information? And are raw data files accessible by anyone? Because let's take, so the way they had their content management set up was, yes, graphic files get uploaded, but then there was this major database. So graphic files were then put into another database. So to make it a little bit more simple, we take something like Exchange. Exchange 2000, you can get access by accessing someone's email account and then going into their folders and reading their information. Or you could attempt to get access to the one big raw data file. I think it's an MDB. Does anyone know? If anyone knows, just shout it out. But what's that?
2000, it's all in AD.
No, it's all in Active Directory in 2000. So bad example for this, but in exchange for Windows NT. So do you guys kind of understand? So the raw data file is going to be that other way of getting access to information. So they want to make sure those are also tied down.
Okay, so first thing we're going to look at is who has rights and privileges to do different things. Todd mentioned at the end of the last slide that you need the manage, auditing, and security logs in order to read the event log. But of course, there are plenty of other user rights that are very important. And here we use LSA enumerate accounts with user rights. This is kind of the one area in Windows NT that's a little different than the rest in that you assign accounts to user rights rather than assigning user rights to accounts. So we would look at something like take ownership of files and see who has that right. Clearly, anybody who has that right, it doesn't matter what the access control list on the object is. They can take ownership of it and then change the access control list, and now they have access to the object. In backup files and restore files and directories, the point of those is so backup programs can read every file on the system, and restore programs can overwrite any file when you're doing a restore. So anyone with those rights inherently bypasses the access control lists on any of the files. So you were going to
There was, yeah, I was actually going to jump in with another Win32 API call, which is, you know, like if you want to, if you want to copy a file or move a file or write to a file, you know, like the copy.ex, you know, copy is a Win32 API call. And there are ways to call these functions. You say, I'm going to call it in regular mode. Well, there's actually an extra mode called backup mode. So you could do anything to these files. So if you rewrote one of these copy programs, which is very easy to do, and to say, instead of calling it with normal mode, call it with backup mode, what it says is, if you have this user right, backup files and directories, we're going to ignore the ACL on the object and allow you to read it. That's correct, read it. If you have restore files and directories, we're going to ignore the ACL on the object and let you do anything you want to it. So these user rights are extremely powerful to a user that might have them that really shouldn't. So typically we only see backup operators getting them and administrators, because one of the things we learned was we used to say, you know, typical consultants going in and saying, well, backup operators should be the only ones who have this. Again, that segregation of duties things. It's actually not quite the case, because administrators are the ones who need to perform the emergency repair disk functions, because an emergency repair disk gives you access to the SAM. Like an NT40, it would actually copy certain SAM information like users' passwords. Well, you can't actually do an emergency repair disk unless you have those two user rights. So now we see you know, backup operators and administrators having those two user rights. And continuing on with the other ones, debug programs would allow someone to modify the way an executable reacts. We saw one attack and penetration where people trying to access the event log. Now, this is the great thing about, you know, hackers. They argue back and forth, back and forth. They say, well, I can't get caught because, you know, I'm going to delete the audit log when I'm done. Well, then the next hacker says, well, yeah, but when you delete the event log, I want to figure out what user you were using, because it's going to say, well, so-and-so deleted the event log as entry number 1. Turns out, you know, if you have something like debug programs or act as part of the operating system, you can do anything you want, regardless of what the GUI is saying. So we've actually seen people write executable programs that go in and modify the event log and say, well, delete it and don't put this entry in it, or delete just one entry of it. And I mean, very dangerous, especially, you know, in forensics jobs, when someone breaks in, taking it to the next level and saying, well, how am I going to prosecute this individual? You know, if lawyers simply state that these, you know, this is the state of the way things are, it becomes almost inadmissible, and, you know, people kind of ignore it. So it's very important to make sure that people don't have debug programs, act as part of the operating system. And one of our favorite ones is replace a process level token. Using Win32 API calls, you could replace, it's actually what they do is they take an object like the system PID, which is, actually I forgot it now, but if you open up your task manager and you take a look at what system is running at, or what lsas.exe is running at, something like 14, you could say, well, take that token, which lsas is running at PID 14 process ID, spawn another copy of that token, run my executable as that. Now what you're doing is you're running an executable as system. So one of the things we've done is, like if you open up the registry and try to get access to the SAM key and read information in there, it kind of doesn't let you do that. Well, you can open up regedit.exe using this Win32 API call, replacing a process level token of lsas.exe and run regedit like that. Now you can access anything in the registry because it's running a system. So very, very powerful user rights. No one should have them. If you're really worried about confidentiality of information or any of the security assertions, really no one should have those except for, we've seen people argue administrators should have them because they're fully trusted anyway. By default, they don't even have replace a process level token or act as part of the operating system, so we would say leave them out.
Okay, here we are, the first thing we're saying is retrieve permissions for directories. Again, this is a place that we would use GetNamedSecurityInfo that we talked about earlier. We'd probably be calling it twice in this function. We call it once to get the DACL, read the ACEs, find out who has access to it. We call it again to get the SACL, find out the audit settings, find out the owner. Depending on the way the system's set up, that information could be very critical to us. If it's a critical file and the ACL is loose on it, but there's auditing, that might not be something we want to go after. If it's got no auditing on that file and it's something that's pretty sensitive, maybe we feel like we could poke away at it for a while. So that's the first. And then we mentioned here, authenticated users should have read as kind of a best practice, and that was mentioned earlier as something that is a step people are already taking. And to tie back into the security configuration manager statement in question earlier, how good is applying those default templates? Well, Microsoft doesn't know about your applications. It doesn't know what you've put on your systems. It knows about the operating system, so that's all it can secure. So one of the places that you have to be concerned with is your data directories, your application directories. Anything that's homegrown, where does it write to the registry? We got to care about those keys. And those are objects that you may want to add to the template. Those are objects that you may want to secure in other manners. But this is how you go about collecting that information.
I guess for the software developers out there, or for people looking to to go after programs, one of the things that we thought was important for technologists trying to secure their boxes was this is a very time-consuming operation. Typically, people would run something like dump ACL or a program that just kind of dumps out everything. Look for programs, or the software developers, you can probe a registry key and find out what the system directory is. Using that, you can kind of append on the secured system directories like /config, etc., and then run kind of a listing off of that. Or you can, if you have a web server that has not, it's using the IIS metabase, go into the metabase and find out, well, what are the directories that exist on the computer for this website? Is it /inetpub, or typically it's something different? And then have your program run after that. It's very manually it's very labor intensive. This is not something clients typically enjoy doing.
Out of all your Win32 APIs, how much of this can you give through ADSI today?
How much of this information, or how much information that we're gathering today?
32 API stuff, right, through ADSI interface.
Right. The information, so from the program that we ran at the front and all the information that we've talked about gathering, most of that does not reside within the Active Directory. File permissions, registry permissions and values, that information still exists in the same place that it existed in NT4. Information that's moving into the Active Directory, now we have all the users live there, all the groups live there, their properties, organizational units, other securable objects along those lines. So those are the types of information that now you would want to call out of the Active Directory using IADs and things along those lines. And we actually don't have that covered in this presentation, but afterwards we can definitely talk about that. So, yes?
How are you looking up SIDs over an all session for what you don't?
The question was, how do we look up a SID of a user through an L session? From Windows 2000.
I can't figure it out myself. If you got an all session code for SID, you can't run off SID to a name, you can't figure it out.
If Windows, would it be, you're talking about native mode only, or you're talking about mixed mode as well?
I mean, mixed mode is not fair.
Well, from the perspective we're looking at here, again, is kind of a securing your business assets, so you're already an admin. And that's the methodology that we've been following along. So I really haven't tried to do what you're asking.
Yeah, that's a stumper. You got us. That's a
We
good,
could brainstorm afterwards, though.
Yeah, that's a good little challenge. I want to try that later, I guess. So now we're like 1.5 cases through this. So you're going to start to see a little things being similar. So we're going to kind of pick up the speed a little bit. But what we're talking about here is net scheduled jobs enum. We want to find out what jobs are running on the box. Doing this API call, you figure out, well, what's the executable that's running, because you want to figure out what the permissions on the executable are so that no one can replace that executable. You also want to find out what it's running as. You know, is it going to be running as system? Very important. Best practice, ensure that files are executed as batches. Ensure that files executed as batches are protected with strong ACLs. Again, very important, because if you schedule a job to run as a system and it's, you know, it's a backup program, well, someone can replace it with their Trojan horse that says, well, don't do the backup, just do a dump of the password hashes.
Right. This goes back to something we were talking about earlier. Again, you may be able to read a registry value. Say, you know, there's a sub-authentication DLL like passfail.dll in there. You can't necessarily change the value of that registry key, but if you can somehow get access to the file system, you replace passfail.dll, and now, you know, the system's running and you've got clear text access to passwords. So that information leads you to the other, which is why, from an assessment standpoint, you need to look at what the registry value is, what's that pointing to, and then go to that object and make sure that object is secure.
Okay, so now we got a fun one, because we're on the network security piece. So we're talking about network shares. So again, by default, the null users will be able to access, not access, but probe and get a listing of all the shares. You also, remember we talked about earlier, get a listing of all the users. So the first thing you want to do is try to connect to all the shares you've gotten as null and see what access you can get. If you can't get any, well, now you have a whole list of other users you could start trying. And there's actually, it's interesting, because we started seeing that, you know, if you try to log onto a box as a user, people were looking for the, you know, bad account password in the event log. So people were getting caught very easily. Hackers were found to be caught because they're trying, you know, the 20 most easiest passwords, like password, training, welcome, whatever. And they were getting caught. So what hackers started doing was using an API call, which is kind of related to this with the shares, but they were actually saying, well, let me try to change that user's password from what I think it is to what I think it is. Because what that says is I'm going to either get back success returned, or I'm going to get an error returned. And if I get a success, well, I know his password is that. So now I figured out a way to brute force attack an account's password extremely quickly, and there's no trace in the event log of invalid password. What it pops up in the event log is object access failure. No questions. So again, going after the shares, now we're going to be trying to brute force attack these shares. Typically, you know, there's going to be one hopefully out there you can get access to and find out what information is on the box. We always see that. We always see someone has some directory out there. Typically, maybe it's, you know, a Napster directory, because people have MP3 files they're sharing with other people. Well, sometimes you can actually get other information in those directories. People just have pooling of information. So you get company information, you get information about the user, you get something maybe that's led to their password, and you try to break in with that. So best practice is to take those share permissions. First of all, never use the default everyone full control. Rather, make those permissions, you know, as secure as the NTFS permissions behind them. So if people don't need write access, just say, you know, users read, or, you know, if it's the marketing department, marketing read.
Question.
With respect to ACLs and shares, isn't it true that NTFS permissions will, I don't want to say take precedence, okay, because you can have...
It's the more restrictive of the two.
Right. It's like the intersection of the
I mean, it's a great question. So the question, just to repeat it for you guys, is, you know, share permissions and TFS permissions, it's 2 layers. What does NT or Windows 2000 consider them as the accurate ones? The more restrictive of the two.
Right, and just before I'll call on you a second, the reason a lot of clients just create the share and say, well, we have NTFS permissions. And again, that leads to information gathering. It's much better to, if someone clicks on the share to get an access denied, then let them open up the share, see all the files in it, and then try to access those files and get their access denied. Because now, you know, they potentially have access to any of those files, or at least they have more information to go with. Yes?
Speaking of NTFS permissions, did NTFS permissions change with the change of NTFS between NT4 and NT7?
Okay.
Yes, they did. I mean, here's the difference. So in NT4, and anyone correct me if I'm wrong, because it's been a while since I've looked at it, but I think it was like full control, read, write, execute, delete, change permissions, and take ownership. Those were like the 6 thing. No, I missed them.
Right, since Service
Well,
Pack
so
4
that was
with
NT4.
Security Configuration Manager, once
right.
you did that add-on, it changed the way ACLs work on NT4, and that was kind of a backport of the 2000 technology. So in addition to more granularity, there's also the concept of deny, which never existed in NT4. It was always just allow or don't include the person. Now you can, you know, say where there used to be 6 or 7 permissions, now maybe there's 14, and you have an allow and a deny. And that's been around for a little while.
I also read that was just an interface change, that those ACEs were available.
No, that's right. The GUI, yeah.
Right. Like, for example, if you went through the GUI to set permissions on a share, you get, you know, full control, change, read, and write. But if you go through the Win32 API, you could set whatever permissions you want on a share. You could set them to be exactly the same as the NTFS level. Yes?
Didn't we see some things being returned differently, though, before Service Pack 4 was installed?
I was doing things in SecEd.
Yeah.
And the problem was I go into the GUI after I did it, it said not compatible with the ACL.
And didn't they remove synchronize? Or no? No, okay.
Right. The point that was just made was if you use if you use Windows 2000 to set permissions on NT4 and then go look at them in NT4, it will report back that this was created with a newer version. Do you want to click OK to delete the ACL on this object, or click Cancel to leave it, and you just can't do anything with it from this OS or from this GUI?
The other thing I want to add, kind of talking a little bit earlier to your point about that allowed paths. Remember we talked about the registry, we were saying, well, the allowed paths, you can't query it. You know, you have to kind of assume things. NetShare Enum that type of attack is kind of similar because NetShare Enum will return to you a listing of all the shares, but it gives you an error for a listing of the permissions on those shares. So what you have to do is you have to kind of say, well, it's the same kind of thing with allowed paths. We know it exists. Now we just have to kind of try it. So what we typically see is people trying, again, that brute force attack. Does everyone have full control? There's no way to find out until you do it. So NetShare Enum, yes, it's no. It only returns half the information. It won't give you permissions on shares. Lastly, auditing. What these guys were most concerned about was, is someone trying to get access to other people's files? So they wanted to set up SACLs, or what's called system access control lists, on the files to see, and they were checking for people doing failures because they didn't have access, so we're checking to see if people were trying. It's the GetNamedSecurityInfo, which we talked about. And again, best practice, it's going to depend on if you have a help desk and how often you can check your event logs, but you know, you want to set them on the sensitive directories, and to the best of your knowledge, review that on a periodic basis. I mean, to the best of your ability, review that on a periodic basis. What's that? Yeah. Case 3, kind of like an E-Trade, it's not E-Trade. Securities trading company has a website, people are coming on, doing transactions. Primary concern, integrity of people's investment portfolios. So why are they doing a security assessment? Transaction have to be accurate, timely, and complete. They want to make sure all these things are being met. And also non-repudiation, which is to prevent people from denying something that they might have done. So if they say that, you know, if we think they bought Microsoft in the morning, we want to make sure that they actually can't deny the fact that they didn't. Primary assessment, to ensure no one can modify data on the machines. Services can't be exploited. And lastly, some type of brute force attack won't go undetected.
Okay, so the first thing we're looking at here is what's the account policy. So we want to find out how long can people use their passwords for, what's the minimum password length, and what's the account lockout policy. Right before I start a brute force attack, if I can find out the account policy, I can customize my code to try 4 attempts, wait 60 minutes, try 4 attempts, and that way I'm not going to create an account locked out, especially if lockout is set to forever. So using NetUser models get, which is a null, you can retrieve information about the entire account policy and the account lockout.
I'm just curious, who here kind of knew that you could, with a null attack, grab account lockout information and password restrictions? It's not very well publicized. The reason for that is the SDK specifically states, typically, it's the exact wording, what is this, net user modals get?
Right, like a tool like DumpACL used to get the account policy, but it wouldn't get the account lockout.
So it says typically authenticated users are required to make this call. Well, no, you can. So that's why there haven't been a lot of hacks around this. And this is great because first thing you want to do when you walk up to a box is connect with null. Hopefully Restrict Anonymous is going to let you get this information and probe the box and figure out what the account lockout is. And now you can figure out, well, how often can I try a password? Hopefully I could try more than before they reset it and break in. Hopefully I'll get lucky with one of them.
Okay. Password hashes, you're probably all familiar with pwdump, pwdump2, programs like that basically read from memory from the registry or from a text file registry on the system and give you a list of passwords, which you could then dump into something like Loftcrack. These are clearly not functions that you could run null. They require, a lot of them require some fancy techniques, DLL injection and thing like that, to run as system in order to get this information. So I kind of looked at this and I'm like, I just got myself confused, but samdump, because David was talking about pwdump and all them, samdump is actually the Win32 API call. So, and it's good to do these types of strength assessments against new users, because typically you will see, if you work for Johnson & Johnson, a lot of people's passwords are going to be Johnson. Goldman Sachs, a lot of passwords might be Goldman Sachs. I don't know. I'm just saying this is typically, what would happen. This is a real light one. Getting volume information about a drive, making sure NTFS is enabled. Sometimes with Windows 2000, you want to see if EFS is enabled. This call is going to let you do that. Won't run on null. And the registry values. So this is the big one for this company. They want to make sure their registry is extremely secured. So as we were talking about earlier, RegConnect registry, and clearly here we are not using null because the WinReg key would stop us from doing open keys and query info values. But this is kind of a layout of the steps you would take in order to get yourself registry values. So one of the examples Todd used a couple times was find out the system directory, C:\win_nt, maybe D:\win_nt, maybe it's D:\win, whatever, and then go from there to try to find access points based on system information. And the second bullet underneath it is to get the DACL information or SACL information on registry keys. Okay. I kind of went quickly through that just because we're running out of time. And if there are further questions on that, again, we could talk about those after and offline.
Yeah, we have enough time to talk about it real quick, but the get security descriptor DACL is kind of like that get name security info thing that we talked about earlier. And you do want to enumerate those services. That doesn't always require administrator and account operator. You can do that at the user level sometimes. So that's kind of like one of those intermediate Win32 API calls that you want to try to get access to. So you are null, you get information, maybe you get a user. Now you're a user, run a new set of Win32 API calls. You're one level higher, get some service information.
And just an FYI, here is get security descriptor DACL. We could also use that on files, and we could also use get name security info on the registry. Just kind of switching it up for exposure. Okay, here we're talking about if the administrator account can be locked out remotely. As some of you may be familiar with the tool PassProp, which on NT4 you could run passpop/admin lockout, and that prevented a brute force attack of the administrator account over the network by requiring the administrator account to adhere to the account lockout policy.
Who's used that or was aware that PassProp even existed? Have you guys tried that on Windows 2000? Turns out on Windows 2000, the GUI will report the information correctly, but there's actually a bug in it. Our development team at Velocicure kind of found that. We're working with actually the guys doing the Microsoft presentation after this, and they're fixing that. But the API calls will give you the accurate information. The GUI will not.
Right.
So
using
basically, so what what the problem is in Windows 2000 is if you run passprop, I just want to make sure, since it's being recorded, if you run passprop and try to do an admin lockout on Windows 2000, the current Service Pack 1, the things that are released as of today, will not actually lock out, will actually not turn on the ability to lock out that account when it's brute force attacked from the network. The GUI reports it as that. However, the brute force attack can continue to go on. It will not report back to you this account has been locked out, which it should after a certain number of attempts have gone through.
Right.
And
the way you go through it is using those functions which are exported by SAMDLL, and it uses the quality of service information structure, which will report the domain account lockout, which you can search for in SDK to see that. And it'll also tell you if, as you may know, passprop could be used to set complex passwords. So that information is also stored in the data structure. We didn't choose to return it here. That wasn't an issue. Yes?
I was curious, do you yourself use the account lockout on the administrator?
Yes. We recommend always turning on remote admin lockout for administrator accounts. We use the passprop tool. That's
Microsoft's tool.
That's Microsoft's tool. It was released, and
resource kit.
It's actually the only tool that I've ever seen that does it other than what we've written to query the information. I've never actually written anything to change those values.
And lastly was the RAS admin port enum, which is going to do RAS. There's a whole other set of calls for routing and remote access services. But again, what you're looking for here is what modems exist, because hackers might want to get that information, then try to do, once they know modems exist, they might want, or even if PPTP, or now it's Windows 2000 L2TP, layer 2 tunneling protocol, another, again, more enticement information, another way to get in perhaps. And lastly, the auditing piece, which is going to say, well, we want to figure out what the audit policy is set. Windows 2000 and Windows NT4 have different audit policy settings, but these are the Windows 2000 NT4 ones. There's a couple extra in Windows 2000, and what we're looking for here is, do we have certain things turned on and off? Because you can't turn on SACLs, which we talked about earlier, which was the directory system access control lists, if you haven't first turned on file and object access. And you won't be able to see whose accounts are being brute force attacked by intruders if log on and log off isn't turned on first.
Right, and just to tie back into what Todd said earlier, because you can use the native function calls to do things a little differently, like attempt to brute force a password by trying to change the password rather than logging on with it, there are event entries like that that'll show up in different places, like an object access failure instead of an invalid username or password. So you can kind of look through, find out those event IDs, and then when you read the event log, which we talked about earlier, you filter on those IDs. And it's a lot easier to find out if that kind of malicious activity is going on. If you couldn't hear Todd, he said we'll take a few questions. We have 2 or 3 minutes left. Otherwise, again, we'd be happy to talk to anybody offline. You have our email addresses, and we'll be here for the next couple of days. And we have up here printouts of this presentation, which you can pick up, which has all the information. It's over here, actually. And that shows the... Those slides are, not the updated ones. And if we run out, we can get you more. Don't worry about it. Thanks.